Coming to you live from Radio Cayman Studio.
For the record.
For the record. For the record. Hear from your government officials, independents, and the opposition on issues that matter to you.
The record.
Engage in an open dialogue between residents and lawmakers.
For the record.
The record.
Informative, impartial, insightful.
This is your talk show.
1-800-534-8255. Your calls, your input. This is For the Record. And now, your host, Orit Connor.
Good morning and welcome to an abbreviated version of For the Record. This morning, we gave way to the piece on Hurricane Ivan, the eye of the storm, and we trust that you enjoyed that. We certainly need to be reminded of what we went through during Hurricane Ivan so that we don't let our guards down and we don't become complacent, that we continue to build smartly, that we continue to recognize when hurricane season is in place, especially the peak of the hurricane season, that we're well prepared for it. So we trust that you enjoyed it. For the Record, of course, is brought to you by Champion House 2 Restaurant, Champion House Restaurant 2 and Champion House Cafe. Champion House Restaurant 2 is located on Eastern Avenue, and Champion House Cafe at 1 Battlefield Place, which is formerly Comart Supermarket. Champion House, of course, is a family-oriented restaurant where locals and others dine. We also have a new sponsor, and For the Record is also brought to you by the Auto Spa on Godfrey Nixon Way. You can stop by Radio Cayman or the Auto Spa and ask for your $5 saving coupon for your next full-service wash. I'm going to dispense with a lot of the introduction this morning, or my introduction, because we're going to be squeezed for time, so I'll probably talk a little faster as well, so I hope you'll be able to understand me. And I'll say the same thing for my guests in the studio this morning also, and for our callers. We would ask you to be brief in your comments so that we can cover as much as possible, because we're only going to have 1 hour this morning until the 9 o'clock hour. We will have For the Record, but we still wanted to ensure that we brought you a portion of For the Record this morning. So here we are, and we have in our studio this morning the usual. You can't go anywhere without the devil being around. So we have Mr. Ivan Farrington. He's here. We have Mr. A. Steve McField, who is still willing to give his time despite the fact that he'll have to be in the courtroom this morning. And as usual, we have Captain Paul Hurlston, who's with us. And we're also graced with the presence this morning of the former director of Radio Cayman, Mr. Loxley Banks as well. So gentlemen, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning.
Well, we've been talking over the past few weeks on Fridays about seafaring, and we understand that it's seafaring in the Cayman Islands, and we understand that it is a very popular segment of our show that people enjoy listening to, the nostalgia, listening to, hearing, some of the familiar names that are familiar to some people, unfamiliar to others, but it is good that people are enjoying that as well. We also wanted to talk about, I guess there are two storms, one in 1941 and 1944, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it right over to Captain Paul Hurlston, since we're just coming off the program on Hurricane Ivan. This is a good way for us to segue into talking about the 41 and the 42 hurricane, and then I'll welcome any of you gentlemen to chime in as well after. Captain Paul?
Yes, 1941 hurricane. Well, that didn't come here to Cayman, but we had a lot of us grief over that, because the schooner Majestic was lost with quite a few men. Can't quote the number, and I think it's only one survivor off what is still alive from her. But she was lost around the Keys. But I know about the 1944 hurricane. That's the one that the schooner Albion disappeared, and she was anchored in Georgetown. And that Sunday evening, the weather came down. Of course, we did not have too much forewarning about these things. It was just the old people how they predicted the weather. And I remember clearly my late cousin Val Hurston, my subby, walked to George. Why we did that in that kind of weather. And on our way back, the limbs was breaking down across the road, and a sheet of zinc blew off one old house right there, in the vicinity of the Pure Ark. Almost got me, and that was a bad hurricane. But nobody ever talks about it. We all talk about the 32, which I don't remember. But no one talks about the 44, which was a bad hurricane also.
And a loss of life?
No loss of life.
Okay.
A lot of property, cattle, and all kinds of things, but there was no loss of life.
And if you other gentlemen were old enough then to remember anything about it?
I remembered about it. I remembered about it, and it was very devastating. I remember sitting on my grandfather's veranda, and you could see right through the place we used to call Catabush then.
Catabush, yeah.
That was in front of us, and I could sit on Mary Street and see the seas breaking out on the waterfront in Georgetown, because the whole Catabush, where Ansbacher building and all of those places, those buildings weren't there then, and Genesis building wasn't there then. So the only buildings on Mary Street was the library, the old town hall, and there was the courthouse wasn't there, and all those buildings were there. So I could see all of the seas breaking, coming up to the post office, and coming over to Catabush, the salt water, and I remember.
And that distance has to be about at least a mile.
At least, yes. And all the fruits were down, the pears and the oranges and the tanja and the grapefruits, and everything was down, was scattered all over. But one of the most serious thing that happened at hurricane was that the sewerage. You know, in those days we didn't have only certain people have
latrines.
Indoor toilet had latrines and what they call back houses, and the latrines. The water overcame the latrines, and the latrines all ran into the water table, into the wells that we had to drink off, and the cisterns. They had to move people out of the place. They used to call it Monkatown and all those places. They had to move people out of there. That's what they used to call it then, and in boats, and take them down to the old town hall and to the public places where they could stay. And the aftermath of that was a outbreak of typhoid fever.
Okay.
Yeah, and one of my cousins died in typhoid fever, and that was the outbreak of that hurricane. And a lot of people were ill afterwards, and we only had one doctor then. We had an old doctor from England, old deaf doctor called Dr. Horder.
Dr. Horder, yeah.
And he would spend a whole day just examine you, and you had to have a funnel to his ears, and he says, Doctor, she says she feels the pain in her left side. And he would be smoking a whole carton of cigarettes at the same time. And that was it. And it took us several years to recover from that hurricane. And remember, then we weren't grant aided. We didn't grant aided. All our the source of our income was from the seamen's remittance coming in. And so it took us. We had to rebuild the country. And I remember going up into the North Sound, and you could see all the fish were all about up where you see the CUC now is, and all those lands were devastated with salt water.
Mr. Ivan,
yes,
you old enough to remember anything?
I believe I'm a little older than Steve. I can't remember far back as him. The 42 storm, I was still staying at a place you call the Gochard where I was born. And a few days after that one of the Majestic went down on. And when they got the news that the people lost, I never heard of much crying and going on in my life, because a lot of people in that area went down on Reginald and his two sons, Uncle Sam Rivers, that's Dick and them grandfather. They lost two sons there, Ollie and Allen. And was a lot of people from that area that the people went down to Majestic. I lost an uncle by the name of Horace. Uncle Chesley Warner, he the one that say Warnell want to stay aboard with his uncles and them seasoned seamen, and Uncle Chesley grabbed them by the arm and pulled them down in catboat, and that's how he's saved.
Wow.
44 I can remember that I moved up on Hell Road then, and and we got some of that here. I remember I was a little ways from the sea then, but I could see the seas, stand up on our porch on Hell Road and see the seas breaking down by the turtle farm there. And sometime them days out northwester, the seas would come over that rise and come right up to the Goat Yard. So that's what I remember about them two storms. But I'll give you a little history that I've never told before about Hurricane Ivan. I had my arteries cleared out in Miami not too long before that. And I was staying out at Hennings Lane, that's opposite where the Asfresco restaurant is now by Captain Alley House. And the developer had dug down, they took off all the topsoil, and I had to say didn't build the house up where it should be. And during that night, when I looked out there, I had a 6-foot fence, and the water was there 1 foot below the fence, and I tasted it was salt water. And after that, I realized it didn't come from that side. It came from the north side, came across Willowfine Drive and came down there. And it settled in our yard for days and days and days, and I couldn't get the house swept out because it go right down to the yard. And sometime, I don't remember when, but after a little bit, my daughters came and got me and carried me down one of their houses, and I never heard a noise like that in my life with the wind blowing and knocking and stuff there. So I was very, very lucky.
Okay. And Mr. Banks?
Well, I don't have much memories of the 42 hurricane. I guess I would have been 3.5, 4 years old, but I do remember the 44 hurricane. I remember going down into what you'd call the center of West Bay, and this would have been after the storm had abated some, and walking with my parents right where the Presbyterian churches, John Gray United churches out in West Bay now, the sea was still coming up to that point. And of course that was the storm that took away the wharf, you may remember, Ivan, which
Yes, I remember that.
which to my mind was a big wharf sticking out maybe 200-300 feet out from the beach. And it also took away, remember the old warehouse? There was a warehouse there, I think. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there was no schoolhouse there at the time, but it washed that away. And remember Mr. Clement's big square stern boat? I think that went in it. And it was quite devastating, for days and weeks. We were feeling the effects of the storm, and I recall where our house was at, right on the beach down at the junction of Town Hall Road and Northwest Point Road. Going down, I don't think that we left the house during the storm, but I remember going out that morning after we could get out of the house, and there was all kind of debris up in the yard and even across the way, which was a big grass piece. There was water standing in that. Where our house was at was on a kind of little, more or less, hill, both sides sloping down. So we didn't, suffer any water damage per se. But the trees was almost like you see what you can remember from Ivan, where everything was stripped.
Mm-hmm. Captain Paul, the Majestic, who was she owned by?
Dr. Roy.
Majestic was Dr. Roy McTaggart. But about the 44 hurricane, people may not remember or know. There was a story on the second story in the library. That's where the U.S. Navy Weather Bureau was stationed up there, and they clocked the wind at 144 miles an hour.
Wow.
In fact, I believe you can still see the bolts up on top of that where the Weather Bureau, the weather dome, they had a dome up there, was anchored down.
Folks, I want to remind you that you're listening to For the Record. I also want to remind you that our phone lines are open. Our toll-free number is 1-800-534-8255. You can also call us at 949-8037. And you can also call us on 949-6990. And of course, if you don't like to talk on the telephone, you can email us at fortherecord, one word, fortherecord at candw.ky. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about seafaring. We're talking about storms that hit the Cayman Islands, but I want our seafarers here in the studio to talk about storms that they would have experienced while out to sea on ships, especially some of those national bulk ships and other ships as well. Places like the Cape of Good Hope, Bay of Biscay, areas where it's historically rough most of the time. Please stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.
The Record with Orit Connor continues right now on Radio Cayman.
Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. I'm your host, Orit Connor, and as I said earlier, this is an abbreviated version of For the Record. This morning I have in the studio with me former director of Radio Cayman, Mr. Loxley Banks. I have Captain Paul Hurlstone, as usual, Mr. A. Steve McFeel, and you can't go anywhere without the devil. You can't leave him behind. Don't want to be tempted by him, but he's always there in the form of Mr. Ivan Farrington. We're talking about 1942-1944 storm, talking about the Majestic. But before we get back to that conversation, I want to wish a very, very happy birthday to an extremely special lady who is a frequent listener. And I shouldn't say frequent, she's a dedicated, ardent, dedicated listener to Radio Cayman, irrespective of what program it is. And that lady is 87 years young today. And Miss Georgette, we all here in the studio want to wish you a very, very happy birthday, and may you live to see many more. Some people always say, may you live until I kill you. So you have a great day.
Why don't we sing her happy birthday?
Sure we can. Gentlemen,
happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Miss Georgette. Happy birthday to you.
Great. May she live to see many more. Loxley, you wanted to tell us about the Majestic and the fact that Radio Cayman actually aired a program about the Majestic as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to that. I guess it was 1978. We did quite a comprehensive program on the wreck of the Majestic. In fact, Alison Ebanks, the pastor at Chapel Church of God, was very much involved in that. And some of the information that came out in that, and some of it, even though it was such a tragedy for the Cayman Islands, there was a little humor also involved in it. And I remember Mr. Dixon, I can't remember his first name, from East End. Eddie right? Yes, Eddie Lou Dixon, telling about the eve of the storm. He told the captain, he says, "Captain, you see those clouds up there? There's a storm coming." The captain said, "No, I don't think, Eddie, I don't think there's anything coming. We'll be all right," because they were anchored. And he said, "Well, I went down in the forecastle and went to sleep." And he said, about 4 o'clock in the morning, I heard steps coming up the deck, and I measured them. I said, "That's the captain." He said, and he poked his head down in the forecastle and said, "Eddie, I think we got a storm." He said, "Yeah, Captain, I told you that last night." But he says, "I'm going to shore because I tell you something. One tree in that little key over there is worth 40 of these masts sticking out of here, so I'm going to shore." And it's quite a story of the sinking of the Majestic. And I think it was already mentioned here that Vernal is the only survivor that's still alive. And Vernal, we hope you're doing okay. We know you had a little health problems here recently, but we hope you're doing okay.
Okay.
And there's also a story about some family of mine. I think he was named Woodley McFeel. He was the cook on the Majestic, and they were all coaxing him to go ashore and say, "Listen, Woodley, let's go ashore." And the Captain Stateman was saying to them, "Listen, if you all abandon the ship, when she get back to Georgetown, we're not going to let doctor I pay you in a salary. And Woodley said, well, this is what I heard. Well, he says, I really can't go. He had to find an excuse not to go ashore because he was actually scared of his captain sanctioning him. So he says, well, I've got my cornbread in the oven and he finished baking yet, so I'm not gonna leave it. I'm not gonna leave it. And the person that told me that, I think that was Mr. Radley told me that.
Okay, and
Mr. Radley told me that. And he said they all went and tied himself on the trees, tied up with attached rope, tied himself around the trees so that the seas couldn't wash him away. And he says when he looked, he saw the majestic part of her anchor.
Yeah.
And they never saw her since.
Mr. Radley told us, he said, when I got back to Hogstye Bay, came in, I think it was Wilson that brought them back, he said, I got down and kissed the ground, and I said, Lord, you brought me back safe. You're not going to have any trouble with me going back out there anymore.
Gentlemen, I'm told we have 2 callers on hold, so we're going to take those callers now. First caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning. Interesting show again. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Ms. Daphne. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you. Quickly, I'll get back to the Majestic, but the one thing that stands in my mind about Ivan, if there's anything that I recall most vividly, is the sound. I tried to put it together. What is the sound? What does it sound like? Well, I guess after a few minutes of thinking about it that night or early morning, I said, it sounds like 100,000 horses, cows, goats, dogs, cats, everything trying to express the pain and the fright that they might be going through. That's the only thing. All of those woven into one. That's me and my Ivan. But anyway, on the Majestic side of things, some of you will remember Uncle Wee Wee. He was, the town, everybody knew Uncle Wee Wee. And anyway, he took my Uncle Whitmore out for his first trip at the age of 14. Uncle Whitmore was named after him. And my grandmother said, in tears, please bring my son back home. And when the Majestic was there, his brother Atwood decided he was going to stay on to the Majestic. And he told him, no way. He said, there's no way that ship can survive. So Mr. Atwood says, this is where we think we're going to go. He decided to stay on the quay with my 14-year-old, who was my uncle, but his 14-year-old nephew. And so anyway, as the storm came, they made a decision that he would tie his nephew into the coconut tree. He said he could tell the fright on him, but he looked at him and said, you look at these coconut trees, son. They survived many a hurricane. You hear what your Uncle Wee Wee's telling you. So he tied him up and he said, I am going to go over to this other one and tie myself. The storm came. At the height of the storm, the coconut trees would go to the ground and back up again. And he said he would hear his nephew shouting, Uncle Wee Wee, Uncle Wee Wee. He said, no, you just hold on. You just hold on. The seas would come, wash over them, and then over the quay again. The wind battered them, but that coconut tree just went down and back up, down and back up. And finally, after all of that, the terrifying time that they went through with that, he said that they looked out and they saw a few pieces of what they believe were pieces of wood floating from the Majestic, and that was it. So they knew that everybody was gone there. My father, on the other hand, was on another quay. They had gone through a really, really, really bad time, but there were several days, no sight of anyone coming. And then my dad said, finally they had caught a few fish, and I think he said they chopped open a couple of coconuts. They had taken their matches and put them in a tin. He said a baking powder tin. And anyway, they saved the matches somehow. And so anyway, there were other things. But the one thing I want to say, because my dad gave us a lot of details, but one of the things was that he just, they were starving. And he said it took and chopped into a sack of flour that had been, the water hardened it, salt water no less, and they chopped into that, and into the middle of that sack of flour that had been hardened he said it was at least a gallon of good flour, and they took that out from the insides of it where it had been hardened, and they made, Johnny cakes, whatever, and that is how they survived. So when my grandfather, Captain Freddy, it was him who went to pick them up on the ship that he was, and said as he got into, in fact, Mr. What's his name?
Caller, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up for us because we got a short period. And
Yeah. Well, anyway, just to say, my grandfather, when he finally got ashore to them, he said, "The whole world is gone." He said, "Get on this ship. Let's go to the northward." Said the whole world is gone. And anyway, gentlemen, that was some of what I remembered about the Majestic. And thank you about that.
Thank you very much for that information as well. That certainly helps, in terms of putting things together. Let's take the next caller. Caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, Mr. Connor, and good morning to the other gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good morning.
I'm good. Just very quickly, and first of all, thanks for taking my call at such a late time. It's amazing that I heard you all mention Vernal, and if I'm just wanted to ask, is that Vernal Ebanks you're speaking about?
That's right. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's my uncle, and it's like I said, it's amazing to hear you all talk about that, because I just learned yesterday about his role with the Majestic, and that's something I had never even known about. And so I just want to say thank you all for keeping the history alive. I learned something yesterday that I didn't even know about my own uncle. And you mentioned that, he wasn't feeling so well. He has been discharged, and his procedure was successful. So he was discharged and has gone back home for recovery.
Good.
That's good to know that.
Okay, so keep educating us, please. This is what we need to know. And I hope that at some stage, before he does die, that he will be remembered in the right way for the role that he played in that ordeal. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, caller, and you do the same also.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
One thing I'd like to just put in here about the Majestic, I was able to talk with Harold Franklin many years ago, who was the navigator on the Wilson that picked up the survivors from the Majestic along with Captain Freddy. And he told me, he said, "Boy, and he after that he went to the States and went to sea, sailed the 7 seas. He said, but what I saw on that morning that we came into the little nook there close to the quay, he says, I hope I'd never see it again. And he was about 80 years old when he told me that story.
Oh, wow.
So and maybe somewhere along the line, that story on Majestic, the total story, can be rerun, because we got so many people here in the Cayman Islands community who cannot comprehend, even though some of them have gone through Ivan, what a big hurricane that we, as Cayman lingo, would really do to this place now. So the more preparedness that we can have, the better off we will be. And I'll just put in a plug here for tomorrow afternoon at 3:30, Radio Cayman, CI Retro, Ivan, remembered, present, and future perspectives will be repeated. So you can tune into that 3:30 tomorrow afternoon on Radio Cayman.
Yeah, people need to listen to that. Now, gentlemen, just for my benefit and the benefit of our listeners who, weren't even born at the time that we were talking about, there was no electronic means of communication. Was it that most of the boats fished in the same area, or that you knew that a particular boat was, like, for instance, the Majestic, that she was out there, so that after the hurricane they knew we better go and look for the Majestic because we know that she's out at the time?
Yes, that's the way it was. Everybody knew the locations where their comrades with the other ships, the vessels, or their key men that ranged on the keys that fished from everybody knew where they were.
I actually, that the Majestic was on what you'd call a late pickup, because I think it was late in October
That's right.
that it happened. And Eddie Lou tells that story, but I won't get into it. Someday I'm sure we'll rerun that program.
Yes, because I can remember that because Dr. Roy, he went around trying to get a crew to go out and to bring these men back home. And old Captain Stedman, he was way up in age at that time. He volunteered to go.
And how long would it take from leaving here to get there?
Oh, that depends on the wind. And usually, that time you never know. 3, 4, 5 days sometimes.
With a good, I guess, would be north wind. They could make it probably in 2 days out.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Less than 3 days.
Mm-hmm. Now, gentlemen, I did my little stint at sea, only 9 months, very short. But in that 9-month period, because I was on an oil tanker running from Europe, from France, Le Havre, and I think we went to a place in the Mediterranean called Port Le Bouc, something like that.
Port Le Bouc, in south coast France.
Yep, and to the Middle East, a place like Coralimaya, and my experience was, of course, going around the Cape. You always experience rough weather around there. But I remember vividly Christmas Day heading back to Europe. And, of course, the tanker's loaded, so she's down low. And we got into a storm in the Bay of Biscay. And the lifeboats and stuff like that broke, their straps, and we had to go back out there. They had to put harnesses onto us and go out there to try to strap them on. And of course, the younger ones on board, I remember myself and a guy, Bothwell Borden from East End, we went out, and Gilbert Connolly, as well, and we went out to do that work, and they actually had to change the direction of the boat to make sure you didn't get washed overboard as well. But you gentlemen must have had some experiences out there as well in terms of storms on National Bulk and other large shipping companies.
Well, the worst experience I had was on an old freighter called the Talbot. We were running coal to Amsterdam from Norfolk, Virginia, and we would make a trip once a month, go and come back, and we got into a storm off the I guess near Hatteras too. We got into a storm, and we loaded with coal going to Holland, and I was down in the engine room, and I was on watch in the engine room, and it got so bad that the water started flooding the engine room from the seas, from up on deck. The water started flooding the engine room, and we were very frightened about it. So we had to have all the pumps. We had to rig up the pumps to get the water out of the engine room, because we didn't want the engines to fail. And the engines were the old freighter did not have turbines. It had up and down diesel engines, and sometimes it would take a long time to get them restarted, because you had to heat them up with blowtorch and all that sort of stuff to get them restarted. And we also had to change course. We had to go off course for 2 or 3 days to try to get out of the storm. I was really frightened. We in the engine room, we had on the life jackets just in case that we had to evacuate the ship. And when she got back to Norfolk, Virginia, I didn't go back on that ship at all. I got off. I paid off, and I went to Baltimore, and then they sent me down to join the old transport.
Okay, Mr. Ivan, you had any experiences out there with storms?
Yes, I had some while on a bulk trader in 56.
Yeah, I was on that same trip with you too.
Yeah. I would look for you to tell that story too. yes. We got caught in a hurricane. We lost the lifeboat. When the lifeboats got washed away, we never did find it. So that was a bad experience, frightening experience. But in 69 or 70, Mr. Loxley probably can enlighten me on that, while tied up in the port of Corpus Christi, Texas, on the Gulf Service, a hurricane came, the one that mashed up Corpus so bad that time. And I had as a captain did not prepare the ship for it. I don't think he put out an extra line or sent sure and got some extra cable. And the first puff of wind I had came, broke air line away, and that ship kept drifting, blowing, and got stuck on the sandbar there. It was a very frightening experience because across there, it looked like the fuel tanks was a fire. I mean, I saw a lot of fire there, so that was a frightening experience.
Okay. Captain Paul, I know you know, with your years of experience, you must have had several of them.
I don't know where to start. But my first one was an old banana vessel owned by Swanee, the Truxton. We were in Miami, and she was sold from Swanee, sold her to Fraser. It was a company out of Miami, Fraser, and he was actually Jamaican, but he had a big shipping company out of Miami. Mm-hmm. So that's the first time I got fired. It was taken off the crew. They wanted us to sail in a hurricane. The hurricane was coming down on the north coast of Cuba. We were in Pier 3, I think it was, in Miami, and he said the fruits was on the dock in Barahona, Santo Domingo. We just had to sail. That's one time I seen the Caymanians stuck together. We wouldn't sail. And a guy was a Norwegian captain. He fired him and sent a guy from Honduras, Mr. Wood, Cyril Wood, I believe was his name. And how he just decided he was going to sail. But we stood up. We wouldn't sail. So they said, well, they said the storm was between Miami and Nueces. We would put into Nueces. But I said, Captain, we're already past. The hurricane's between here and Nueces. How we're going to reach there? And that night, nobody decided. It was only one person said he would go. And he said, well, since you want to double up the lines, double up there. So there was a hurricane, nothing coming, why double up the lines and everything? Well, and the following evening, we almost went on the dock. The tide came up so high, we almost went on the dock, almost mashed up alongside the dock there in Pier 3 in Miami.
Probably almost up in stones.
Yeah, of course we got fired. The whole crew got fired for that.
Okay. And before we go to a quick break, I'm going to get Mr. Banks to relate any experience that he had out there.
Well, I really never went to sea. I did work in 2 shipyards around Miami, but I can tell you that Caymanians have seen lots of adventure and frightening times out there on the high seas. I mean, some of them tells the story. Franklin Thompson tells the story that they were caught in a storm one time, and I think it was about 5 or 6 days that they couldn't come out of the room. He was on one of those tankers. Maybe one of you guys might have been with him. I don't know, but we can't forget Sherlock Farrington, who went down Cape Hatteras, who's mentioned around here this morning, and maybe Captain Paul, you might quickly tell that story because I think you're very familiar with it.
You better believe that.
If I can, I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Captain Paul. We're going to come right back to that as soon as we take a quick break. I just want to remind our listeners that For the Record is brought to you by Champion House Restaurant 2 and Champion House Cafe. Champion House Restaurant 2 is located on Eastern Avenue, and Champion House Cafe at 1 Butterfield Place, formerly Comart. Champion House, of course, is a family-oriented restaurant where locals dine. Also, For the Record is brought to you by the Auto Spa on Godfrey Nixon Way. Stop by Radio Cayman or the Auto Spa and ask for your $5 savings coupon for your next full-service wash. Please stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. I'm your host, Dorrit Connor, and my guest in the studio with me this morning is Mr. Ivan Farrington, Mr. Steve McField, Captain Paul Hurlston, and Mr. Loxley Banks. And we're talking about seafaring in the Cayman Islands, talking about the Majestic, talking about hurricanes, experiences at sea. And before I get back to Captain Paul, I spoke last week, actually, I got a text from a family member of Mr. Urban Miles, and they wanted to remind me that he was famous on board ships. I think he was a steward? A steward as well. And they figured that several of you may have sailed with Mr. Urban Miles as well.
Oh, he was great. He was one of the few stewards I've seen wanted you to eat. Most of them, but he's special. Oh, he was great. He was a good cook. He was and he's one of the cleanest men I've ever met. And he was a fantastic cook up to his old. I used to visit him all the time up to when he died. Just before he died, he was still cooking. Okay. And he allowed you to eat it.
Good. Now, I interrupted you earlier for the commercial break, so Captain Paul, go right ahead.
Oh, well, this is kind of a tough one for me. 1955, I was working for Swanee Fruit and Steamship Company. Well, they dropped the fruit off at that time, just Swanee Steamship Company, and old converted LSTs. We were loading out up in the Bay of Fundy, two ports up in Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia, Hansport, Nova Scotia. That's one of the largest tide falls in the world. We used to load 5,500 tons an hour and a half. You had to go in when the tide was going in and leave before they ebbed. And we were sailing. I was a Dutchman captain, a very nice man, and he was a little coward, but he's probably still alive. And we used to come down around the coast there from Cape Sable, go across the Cape Cod Canal and go down Long Island Sound, coast of Long Island into New York, Philadelphia, about there. And the company said he was taking too long, so they removed him and put a Danish captain on. And he was said he was going to go outside of Nantucket Lightship, make it so much. He's still out there, by the way. He's still. Anyhow, I took in with a pain in my left side of my chest, and I thought I went to the Marine Hospital in Staten Island, and outpatient, and they took all kind of tests, and they said they couldn't. The day the doctor got the results back, he called me and said, "Son, I can't find anything wrong with you." I said, "My only advice is to keep clear of cheap whiskey and wild women." The doctor can do without the whiskey. But
that was no problem for you.
But that ship went down, and she loaded in Cape Breton Island, Little Narrows, up the Bay of Brador Lake, and on her way back to Philadelphia, she went down with 24 men.
That was around Hatteras.
Yes, but no, it's south of Hatteras. Well, north of Hatteras, just south of Halifax. And my dear friend Sherlock Warren was the chief officer, and Fletcher Seymour from Georgetown he was at AB, and so I had some close calls. But that North Atlantic can get rough, can get bad.
Yeah, I'm told we have one caller on the line, so we're going to take that caller. Just want to remind everyone that we will be going on until 10 o'clock this morning, so we have about 6 minutes left. Caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, Lucy.
Morning, how are you? Roops?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Captain Paul. Good morning, Ivan. Good morning, Mr. Mike Field.
Good morning.
And I think there's another one, but I missed No Rocky.
Good morning.
Yeah. I've listened to you talking about hurricanes and other things as well.
Uh-huh.
I sailed with a man, a captain named John Gates from Texas. And they used to call him the Black Cat because everywhere he went, we ran into rough weather. So we were going. I can't remember which hurricane it was, but we were coming out of Baltimore, and the submarines and ships and all they were heading back in. But he didn't heed that. He came out and we got in a hurricane. I believe it was Janet. 2.5 days.
Wow.
And I mean, I know things are rough on land, but things are rough on the sea.
Yep, much more challenging.
Yeah. We couldn't turn around. And we just peeped out there for 2.5 days before it abated. Continued on, went to Venezuela and loaded at Isle from Port La Cruz and headed back for Portland, Maine. And hit a northwester coming up when we got to Cape Hatteras. And 3:10 in the morning, the Ulysses hit that, and she broke the seal over her skylight down into the engine room. We had a chief engineer that they always referred to him in the office as the man that if he fired you, you ought to be fired.
Sunday Mayo.
Sunday Mayo.
It's amazing.
A couple of times I've seen him angry, but that was one it woke everybody on the ship. And he came down. She was turning at 102 revolution per minute. He cut her down to 75 and told the engineer, if the captain calls for more speed, call him. 8 o'clock that morning, he rung her up again. This captain, but I made a mistake. That was different captain. This one was Captain Charles Kapelowitz. Hey, Captain Paul, you may have known him.
Oh, Charlie.
He was always drunk. And so Keith came down, cut her down to 70. And that, we made it into Portland, Maine, but everything that she had, like boat, chain rail, the lot were broke down with ice. But it was cold, and it froze. Everything froze up. She couldn't clear it. And for days after we left Portland, Maine, to go back to Venezuela, the junk, the ice was dropping off of the wings of a bridge. Man, what a mess that was. But I've been in a few storms too, and this one, the one you were talking about this morning, the 44th storm, that was the one they called the 5-day storm. That lasted for 5 days, in and out, in and out. Of course, we didn't have much anything to be destroyed in, but what we had, the little crops, they were all flat, Well, it's been rough in this place, and it's amazing what the Cayman Islands have gone through.
Oh,
God has been so good to us. We must got a special place.
Yep, and we really have to heed that, Roops.
Yeah.
Want to thank you very much for those details, sharing those with us, and want to encourage you to continue to listen to Radio Cayman and For the Record as well. And you have a great weekend, Roops.
All right, I'd just like to mention one incident here, seagoing, local Caymanians on the Jimson, and there's quite a interesting story to this. They had to chop the mast, and that's not the only schooner I think that they had to do that to survive. But they had to chop the mast out of the Jimson. Captain Curry, I think, was captain, and Harold Banks. And to think that some of those guys had to get out and the Jimson was a small boat, on a deck, tossing backward and forward, up and down, with an axe, and chop a mast. And a mast was what, about 4 inches in diameter? No, 12 inches? 12 inches in diameter.
10 to 12 inches.
And hardwood.
And hardwood. And that
had to chop the riggings along with it.
That was how they survived that storm, chopping all that stuff down in a storm.
I'm told by our engineer that we got 1 minute left, so here's what I'm going to do. I just want to say that it's remarkable that, after so many years, you gentlemen can remember the names of captains and chief engineers and remember, how many revolutions, the engine was going at. It's really amazing, but, it is a part of, your life, a part of it that you never forget, I guess. So I'm going to give each one of you 30 seconds to wrap up. I don't know how we get 30 seconds out of a minute, but we're going to get it. Loxley, you, and then Captain Paul, and then Mr. Stephen.
You mentioned about, but that, what we just talked about, goes back to the schooling, the bringing up that, the older folks had in the Mrs. schools, the Miss Redley schools, and Matt can name the ones in Georgetown and so forth and so on. the discipline and the dedication, I think, that was instilled in us.
Yep.
And I just like to say that I think with all of the exposure to hurricane preparedness here in the Cayman Islands that has happened, people should have been exposed to over the last 2 weeks. I hope that it will produce great benefit to our preparation. And, we can never be prepared too much for any kind of disaster.
Can't
really.
be over-prepared, that's true.
I think, folks heard a little bit of it around here this morning, and we'll just have to continue to be prepared.
Captain Paul?
Well, all I'd say, thank you for having me, and I want to personally wish Georgia a happy birthday. I know she's listening.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, Captain Paul. Ms. McPhail?
I just want to say that most of our experiences abroad started with at home.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have anything else but the Boy Scouts when I was growing up. It was my life. And you talk about memory. I remember I used to memorize Scouting for Boys. And Teacher McPhee would say, ask Steve what page is on. It was like a Bible to me. And so when we went to camps, everything was geared toward going to sea. The watches, the names of the ships, the aft and forward and starboard and stuff, the rate and the blue lights and things. So we knew what to expect when we got on board the ship. We were not neophytes. We already had experience on land. So we had to transfer that on the ships, and that was a great experience to me. And you must remember then, we were young. I think when Captain Curry cut that mast out, he was not even 20 years old.
Probably not.
Yeah, he was not even 20 years old as a captain, and with passengers on board the ship too. So we took life seriously from an early age. You had to be, in order to say, you had to be a man quick. Otherwise, you, like as Dolores told me, nigga, he says, if you can't work aboard the ship, you can't eat. you can't eat.
Mr. Ivan?
Yes, thank Radio for Cayman for having you there and the listening public. I don't have too much more to say because I gave Loxley and Steve some of my time. Have a good day.
Okay, folks, we want to thank our sponsors, Champion House Restaurant 2 and Champion House Cafe. And we also want to thank our other sponsor, the Auto Spa on Godfrey Nixon Way, where you can stop by Radio Cayman today or the Auto Spa and ask for your $5 savings coupon for your next full service wash. And just remember that Champion House Cafe is located at 1 Butterfield Place, which is formerly Comart Supermarket, and Champion House 2 is located on Eastern Avenue. Folks, I want to remind you that we are our brothers and our sisters keepers, that there is always someone less fortunate than we are. If it's someone that you know, someone you're acquainted with, your next door neighbor, hold out a helping hand to them. I encourage you to perform a random act of kindness today, and if you can't do that, then maybe donate to a worthy charity. And we always leave you with the words of Mr. Billy Withers, lean on me. I want to say to all of you folks who are listening, thanks for supporting Radio Cayman. Thanks for supporting For the Record, and we will be back on Monday, God's willing. Take care. Have a great weekend.